They sent the ugly daughter as a joke. She became everything the Lakota had dreamed of. Take her. The words were spoken with the thin smile of someone finished pretending, and the girl stood very still as her family's laughter thinned into something sharper, the kind that cut because it expected agreement, not resistance. And when the Lakota men looked from the bundle of trade goods to her face, she felt the familiar heat rise, not from shame, but from the certainty that the decision had already been made without her. Someone behind her muttered the word ugly again, quieter this time, as if saying it softly made it kinder, and her mother did not correct it, only turned her head and said this was how things were done, that it was better this way, that at least she would be fed, the mercy of convenience offered like a gift. The Lakota elder studying her did not smile, did not frown, only watched as she lifted her chin the way she had learned to do when laughter tried to press her down, and the silence that followed unsettled the traders more than open refusal would have, because it forced the insult to stand on its own. "She's a joke," one of the men insisted, eager to reclaim control, explaining that the prettier sister had been promised elsewhere, that this was the extra, the one no one wanted. And the girl felt the words land as they always did, heavy but dull, familiar enough to be endured, yet something in the elder's gaze made her heart quicken, not with hope, but with attention she had never been given before. The Lakota women nearby watched quietly, eyes measuring not her face but her posture, the way she kept her hands steady despite the heat and the eyes and the knowledge that she had been offered as an apology no one believed was owed. Her father cleared his throat and said this was generous, that a daughter was still a daughter even if she lacked what men noticed first. And the girl bit the inside of her cheek to keep from speaking, because she had learned how words could be used against her long before they could save her. The elder finally spoke, asking what she knew of work, of seasons, of carrying water when the ground cracked and tending fires when the wind cut hard, and the traders exchanged glances, unprepared for questions that did not orbit her appearance. And when the girl answered, voice steady, listing tasks and years and endurance, the laughter faltered, uncertain how to handle a story that did not end where it was supposed to. The insult hovered between them, suddenly exposed, and the elder nodded once, not in agreement but in recognition, and said that jokes were meant to disappear after laughter, that this one had lasted too long. The girl felt the ground shift under her feet, not into safety but into possibility. And as the trade concluded without flourish, she understood that being sent as a joke did not mean she had to live as one, because for the first time someone had looked past the word, meant to finish her and asked instead what she carried, and in that small, dangerous opening, a different future began to breathe. The journey away from her family's land began without ceremony, the wagons turning as if nothing of value had been left behind, and she walked beside the Lakota women, with her bundle held tight, listening to the laughter fade until only the creak of leather and the rhythm of steps remained, a quiet that felt heavier than mockery because it asked her who she would be without it. She did not look back, not out of pride, but because looking back had never changed anything. And when the first night fell, she helped where she could, tending the fire with practiced care, fetching water without being told, moving as someone who knew how to be useful without announcing it, habits learned in a house where usefulness was the only defense against contempt. The Lakota women watched without comment, eyes sharp but not unkind, noting the way she rose before dawn to feed the fire, the way she waited to eat until others had taken their share, the way her hands moved with patience rather than haste. And she felt their attention like weather, not judgment, something to be endured until it passed or settled. A younger girl whispered once that the traders had said she was a joke, testing the word to see if it still held power here, and she answered simply that jokes ended when people stopped laughing, then returned to her task, and the girl did not press again. The elder spoke little as they traveled, but when he did, his questions were practical, asking about winters she had survived, about injuries she had tended, about the kind of silence a person learned to keep when words only sharpened cruelty. And she answered honestly, understanding that embellishment would betray the very endurance she was trying to explain. By the second day, the blisters on her heels had split and bled, and she bound them herself without complaint, because pain had never impressed anyone who had already decided her worth. And when one of the Lakota women noticed and handed her fresh cloth without a word, the small kindness landed deeper than praise ever could have. At camp that night, as the wind pushed smoke low and children huddled closer to the fire, she sang softly while mending a torn strap, not for attention, but because songs made work bearable, and the tune drew a pause from those nearby, the sound carrying something steady and unafraid that had not been expected. The elder listened from the edge of the firelight, his gaze thoughtful, and later told her that people revealed themselves most clearly when they believed no one important was watching, a truth she understood too well. As days passed, the insult that had followed her like a shadow began to lose its shape, not because it was forgiven or forgotten, but because it no longer found a place to land, and she realized with a quiet certainty that what her family had failed to see was not hidden beauty or secret grace, but the simple fact of her persistence, the way she kept going without being invited, and in that realization, she felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest, not pride, not hope, but the first solid sense that being overlooked had taught her how to see, and that this skill, unnoticed by those who sent her away laughing, was already changing the way the Lakota looked back at her. By the time they reached the summer camp near the bend in the creek, the rhythm of the Lakota household had begun to settle around her like a garment she did not yet know how to wear, familiar enough to move in but still heavy with expectation, and she noticed how quickly usefulness became trust when it was offered without demand. She rose before first light to stir the coals and check the lines, her movements quiet so as not to wake the children, and when the day unfolded, she took on what was left undone, carrying water farther than asked, splitting kindling with careful blows that spared the blade, listening more than she spoke because listening had always been safer. The women spoke among themselves in low tones, not about her face or the trader's joke, but about stores that needed mending, about a sick child who would not eat, about the coming weather and what it would take to be ready, and when one of them handed her a task without explanation, she felt a small, steady relief, the comfort of being needed without being inspected. The elder watched from a distance, noting how she did not rush to prove anything, how she did not shrink when corrected, how she accepted instruction as a shared language rather than a verdict. And in those details, he saw the outline of something he had long believed but rarely said aloud, that strength revealed itself most clearly where pride had been worn thin by endurance. One afternoon, as she knelt by the creek scrubbing a pot, a Lakota boy asked her why she never spoke of her family, and she answered that some houses taught you what to carry and others taught you what to leave behind. A reply that drew a thoughtful silence rather than laughter, and the boy returned to his work without pressing, as if understanding did not always require more words. That evening, as the camp gathered for food, a storm rolled in from the west, sudden and sharp, and when the wind snapped a shelter pole loose, she moved without hesitation to brace it, calling for help. Only after she had taken the weight herself, the rain soaking her through as she held until others arrived, and when the shelter stood again, the elder met her eyes across the clearing, recognition plain and unadorned. Later, as thunder faded and the fire was rebuilt, he spoke quietly to one of the women about the kind of partner a household truly needed, not the one who drew attention first, but the one who stayed when attention moved on. And though he did not name her, she felt the shift all the same, the way conversations angled slightly differently when she passed, no longer measuring but considering. That night, as she lay listening to the creek swell with rain, she understood that the dream the Lakota had carried was not of beauty or novelty, but of steadiness, of someone who could hold when the weather turned and the work grew heavy, and for the first time she allowed herself to wonder whether being sent as a joke had brought her by a crooked path into the very place that had been waiting for what she already was. The trouble did not arrive with shouting or weapons, but with voices carried on the wind, thin and careless, drifting in from the trade path one afternoon as two men approached camp too easily, their laughter preceding them like a warning no one had asked for. And when she heard it, her hands stilled on the hide she was scraping, because she recognized that sound, the particular ease of men who believed the world agreed with them. They spoke loudly of the trade, of how clever the joke had been, of how the Lakota would discover soon enough what they had been given, and the words slid into the camp as if they belonged there. An insult stretched across distance in hopes it would land where it always had. A few of the Lakota women glanced toward her, not with doubt but with assessment, waiting to see whether the old story would claim its place again. And she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the instinct to disappear before being pushed. The elder stepped forward instead, his voice calm as he asked the men what business brought them so far from the path, and one of them grinned, saying they had come to see how the joke was settling, how the ugly daughter was being received, and the laughter that followed faltered when no one joined it. The Lakota men shifted subtly, not threatening, but present, and the space between the visitors and the camp grew heavier, because mockery that expected applause found none. The elder replied that jokes were meant to be shared by those who understood them, and that this one had traveled too far to belong to the men who told it, words that cut not with anger, but with dismissal. She stood then, not to defend herself, but because hiding would have confirmed the story they carried, and when she met the visitors' eyes, she did so without apology, her posture steady, her hands stained with work she had been trusted to do. One man scoffed and said she did not look different, and the elder answered that difference was not always visible to those who only looked once, a remark that drew a quiet murmur of agreement from the camp. The visitors shifted, irritation creeping in as the power they expected refused to settle, and one muttered that the Lakota would tire of her soon enough, that they would see what everyone else had seen. And the elder replied that seeing required time, something the men had never given her. As the visitors retreated, their laughter thinner now, she felt the old shame loosen its grip, replaced by a steadier awareness that the story had been challenged in daylight, not by her denial, but by the life she was already living. When the camp returned to its work, the interruption fading as quickly as it had come, she realized that the laughter which had once defined her had traveled all this way only to find no place to rest, and that in refusing to echo it, the Lakota had done more than defend her. They had quietly ended the joke by refusing to repeat it. The days that followed tested the camp in quieter ways, the kind that revealed character without ceremony. And when a late frost bit hard and cracked the creek's edge into brittle plates, it was she who noticed first how the stores would thin if nothing changed, counting portions in her head the way she always had, not out of fear but habit. She spoke carefully, not telling anyone what to do, only asking whether the hunt might shift sooner, whether grain should be stretched with roots she knew how to find, and the questions landed with weight because they were practical, not performative. The Lakota women moved with her into the low ground where the earth still held warmth, and she worked until her fingers ached, digging and sorting with the patience learned from years of being overlooked, because overlooked people learn to finish what others started. When a child fell ill that night, fever rising sharp and fast, she stayed awake grinding bark and heating water, remembering remedies her grandmother had taught her in whispers meant to avoid ridicule. And when the child slept at last, the mother's quiet gratitude felt heavier than praise. The elder observed without comment, noting how she did not claim credit, how she stepped back once the crisis passed, returning to the margins where work waited rather than applause. And in that restraint, he recognized the shape of trust. Word spread slowly through the camp, not as a proclamation, but as a series of small acknowledgments, hands passing her tools without asking, eyes meeting hers in agreement, tasks assumed rather than assigned. And she felt the shift not as celebration, but as belonging earned through repetition. One afternoon, a storm broke without warning, tearing at shelters and snapping a tether, and as people rushed to secure what they could, she braced a pole alone until help arrived, her feet skidding in mud, her shoulders burning, refusing to let go because letting go would have cost more than the pain. And when the shelter held, the camp breathed again. Later, as fires were rebuilt and the rain eased into mist, the elder spoke to her privately, not to elevate her, but to ask her counsel, to ask how she saw the seasons turning and what she would prepare for next. And the question struck her deeper than any compliment, because it assumed a future in which her sight mattered. She answered honestly, naming risks and remedies, not promising ease. And he listened without interruption, accepting that wisdom did not require ceremony to be real. That night, as she lay near the fire listening to the camp settle, she realized that what she held when things broke was not strength borrowed from anger or pride, but steadiness forged by years of carrying weight without being thanked, and that this steadiness, dismissed as nothing by those who sent her away, was exactly what the Lakota had been dreaming of all along, even if they had never known how to name it until she showed them, quietly, what it looked like. The change became undeniable the morning the elder called the camp together, not with urgency, but with the deliberate calm reserved for decisions meant to last. And as people gathered near the central fire, she felt a familiar urge to step back, to place herself where notice could not find her, until one of the women touched her arm lightly and nodded for her to stay, the simple gesture anchoring her where she stood. The elder spoke of winter paths and alliances, of the kind of household that endured when weather and loss pressed hardest. And as he spoke, his gaze moved across the faces, not searching for beauty or bravado, but for signs of steadiness, the quiet readiness that did not ask to be named. Then he said plainly that dreams were often misunderstood, that people believed them to be visions of abundance, when in truth they were questions of survival. And he gestured toward her without ceremony, saying that what had arrived in their camp was not a joke, but an answer, words that settled over the gathering with a weight that did not need applause. She felt heat rise in her chest, not from pride but from the shock of being spoken about, as if she were present rather than discussed. And when the elder asked whether she would remain with them by choice, not obligation, the question steadied her more than any promise could have, because it offered belonging without erasure. She answered yes without embellishment, her voice clear, and the simplicity of it felt like the closing of a door that had been rattling open and shut her entire life. The women nodded, some smiling softly, others simply returning to their tasks as if the matter were settled. And in that ordinariness, she felt the truth of what was happening, that acceptance here did not require spectacle. Later, as the camp dispersed, she worked alongside the others with the same care she always had. Yet something in the way tools were shared and instructions offered had shifted. The unspoken assumption now that she would be there tomorrow and the next day, and the day after that. A young girl asked her to show her how to set a line properly, trusting the lesson without testing it first, and she realized how trust grew not from declarations, but from being watched over time. That evening, as the fire burned low and stories drifted through the circle, the elder spoke again, this time of dreams carried by a people who had learned to survive without certainty. And though he did not name her, she felt herself woven into the story as naturally as the land and the seasons he described. When she lay down to sleep, the wind moving gently through the grass beyond the shelters, she understood that the dream the Lakota had always held was not of being impressed or saved, but of finding someone who would stay, who would carry weight without counting the cost aloud. And for the first time, she allowed herself to rest without waiting for laughter to return, because the word that had once followed her like a shadow no longer had a place to stand, having been replaced by something stronger and quieter. The knowledge that she was no longer a joke passed between hands, but a choice made in daylight, spoken clearly, and meant to endure. The test arrived without announcement on a morning that looked like any other, the sky pale and undecided, the air carrying the faint promise of warmth. And she sensed it first, not through danger, but through imbalance, the way voices shifted when a scout returned earlier than expected and spoke in low tones about riders moving along the outer trail. Men who did not belong to the season or the work. The camp did not panic, but it did not ignore the warning either. Tasks adjusting subtly as people moved closer together, and she felt the familiar pull to make herself small, until one of the women handed her a bundle of hides and nodded toward the children, trusting her without explanation. She gathered them calmly, counting heads and hands the way she always did, guiding them toward the shelter of trees where sound softened and paths narrowed. And as she worked, she kept her voice level, because fear borrowed its strength from tone more than truth. The riders appeared at the edge of the clearing soon after, not charging, not calling out, only watching, measuring the camp with the quiet entitlement of men accustomed to deciding how much space they were allowed to take. And she felt the old insult stir like a reflex, the assumption that someone like her would be invisible in moments that mattered. Instead, the elder stepped forward and asked what they sought, his voice steady, and when one of the riders laughed and said they had come to see the camp that took in a joke, the sound landed flat because it met no echo. She stood then, not at the front but where she could be seen clearly. The children gathered behind her, her posture unyielding without being defiant, and when the rider's gaze flicked toward her with expectation, he found no apology waiting. The elder replied that jokes were for those who had nothing to protect, that this camp protected its own, and as he spoke, The Lakota men shifted into place, not threatening, simply present, and the balance tipped quietly. The riders lingered, searching for weakness that did not present itself, and finally one muttered that the winter would be hard, that choices had consequences, words meant to unsettle rather than inform, and she answered before the elder could, saying that winters were always hard, that preparation decided who endured them, and the simplicity of the truth stripped the threat of its shape. The riders withdrew without ceremony, dust settling behind them as they disappeared along the trail, and only then did she feel the tension ease in her shoulders, the delayed tremor of responsibility passing through her. The women resumed their work, the children returned to their games, and the elder met her eyes with a look that carried neither surprise nor praise, only confirmation. Later, as the day unfolded and the camp's rhythm restored itself, she understood that the test had not been about confrontation or courage in the moment, but about steadiness under attention, about whether the life she had built here would hold when the old story tried to return and claim its space. And as the sun climbed higher, she knew with quiet certainty that it had, because she had not needed to become someone else to pass it, only to remain exactly who she had already proven herself to be. The days after the riders left carried a different weight, not heavier but clearer, as if the air itself had decided to settle on what it had witnessed, and she felt it in the way people moved around her now, not cautiously and not with ceremony, but with the easy confidence of inclusion that did not need to be explained aloud. Work continued as always, yet the unspoken lines had shifted, tasks handed to her without hesitation, decisions checked against her judgment as naturally as the weather was checked against the sky. And she realized that trust had finally crossed the line from observation into reliance. One afternoon, as preparations were made for a move to higher ground before the first true cold, the elder called her to walk with him along the edge of the camp, not to instruct but to listen, and he spoke of the winter routes his people had followed for generations, of the kind of person who kept families alive when strength failed and pride proved useless, and she understood that this was not a lesson being offered but a truth being shared. He asked her what she saw when she looked ahead, not as a test but as an invitation, and she answered honestly, naming the places where wind cut hardest, where water would freeze last, where stores would stretch if measured carefully. And as she spoke, she felt the final thread of doubt loosen, because no one interrupted, no one corrected her for speaking, no one laughed. Later, as the camp gathered to mark the coming shift of season, the elder spoke again, not singling her out with praise, but stating plainly that she had been chosen to remain, not as obligation or charity, but because the life of the camp would be stronger with her in it, and the words carried a weight that silenced even the children. She stood quietly as eyes turned toward her, not shrinking and not reaching, and in that stillness she felt something settle that she had never known before, the certainty that she did not need to perform gratitude to deserve her place. When the moment passed, the camp returned to its work without fuss, and the ordinariness of it struck her harder than celebration ever could have, because it meant the decision was complete. That evening, as she sat near the fire mending a torn pack, one of the Lakota women sat beside her and spoke of the coming winter, as if it were a shared problem already solved by shared effort, and the simple assumption filled her with a quiet warmth. She thought then of the laughter that had followed her from her family's land, how it had shaped her posture and narrowed her voice, and she understood that laughter only held power where it was allowed to linger, where no one contradicted it with action. Here, it had been replaced not by argument but by choice, repeated and consistent, and as the stars rose and the camp settled into sleep, she realized that being chosen without laughter was the truest answer the world could offer to the joke she had been sent as, because it meant she was no longer defined by what others had tried to discard, but by what she had quietly built day by day until the dream that had never been named finally found its place in her. The past did not surrender quietly, and it returned on a cold morning, carried by 3 figures cresting the ridge above camp, their shapes familiar enough to tighten her chest before her mind named them, because some presences announced themselves through memory rather than sound. Her family had come, not with urgency or shame, but with the careful confidence of people who believed time had softened everything, that what was sent away could always be claimed again once it proved useful. They stood at the edge of the clearing as if waiting to be invited, her father clearing his throat and saying her name in the same tone he once used to call her inside before dusk, and the sound landed strangely now, stripped of authority by distance and choice. He spoke of misunderstandings, of hard seasons and foolish laughter, of how blood was blood, no matter how jokes were told, and she listened without moving, aware of the way the camp had already shifted around her, children guided away quietly, men standing present without hostility, women watching with a steadiness that did not require instruction. Her mother avoided her eyes, speaking instead of duty, of how a daughter belonged with her people, and the words echoed old walls that no longer enclosed her, because belonging that demanded erasure had lost its claim. The elders stepped forward and asked plainly why they had come now, after seasons of silence, and her brother answered too quickly, admitting that word had traveled of her value here, of the work she had done, the trust she held, and in that admission the truth laid itself bare without accusation. She felt the familiar instinct to shrink, rise, and pass, replaced by something steadier. And when she spoke, her voice did not tremble, stating simply that she had not been sent as a daughter, but as a joke, and that jokes did not grant ownership when they turned useful. The words landed hard, not because they were loud, but because they were final, and the silence that followed belonged to the land rather than to anyone's permission. Her father protested that they had done what they could, that the world was cruel, that survival demanded sacrifice, and she answered that survival did not require abandonment, only courage, something she had learned too late to give back. The elder listened, then said that people were not traded twice, that a choice made publicly carried its weight forward, and that what stood before them now was not something misplaced, but something chosen. The family shifted, uncertainty breaking through entitlement, and her mother reached out once as if to reclaim habit, stopping short when she did not move, the distance between them no longer bridged by blood alone. At last they turned away, retreating without curses or threats, because there was nothing left to argue once the story refused to bend, and as they disappeared over the ridge, she felt the final thread loosen, the one that tied her worth to their approval. The camp breathed. Again, work resuming without comment, and she understood then that what they had come to take back was not her body or her labor, but the comfort of believing they had been right all along, and in refusing to return, she had taken that comfort away, leaving behind a truth that could no longer be laughed into silence. The morning after her family left, the camp woke into a quiet that felt deliberate, as if the land itself had decided to mark what had ended, and she moved through her tasks with a steadiness that surprised her, not because pain was gone, but because it no longer directed her steps. The elder asked her to walk with him beyond the shelters where the ground opened toward the long view of hills and sky. And there he spoke not of the past, but of the future, of winters that would come regardless of who laughed or who stayed, of children who would grow strong only if taught by those who knew how to endure without bitterness. And as he spoke, she realized that this was the dream that had never been named aloud, not of perfection or pride, but of continuity, of a life that held when tested from every side. He told her that being chosen was not a reward, but a responsibility, that the Lakota had learned to value those who carried weight quietly, because such people did not leave when seasons turned harsh, and she felt the truth of it settle into her bones, recognizing herself not as someone transformed, but as someone finally placed where what she already was could matter. When they returned to camp, no announcement followed, no ceremony marked the moment, only the simple continuation of work shared and decisions made together. And in that ordinariness, she found the deepest confirmation, because nothing more was required to prove her place. She helped raise a new shelter that afternoon, her hands moving with confidence earned through repetition, and when a child asked her why she never spoke of being sent away, she answered that some stories ended when they were no longer needed, a reply that felt complete rather than evasive. As the sun lowered and fires were lit, the camp gathered in its familiar circle, voices blending into the sound of evening, and she realized that the word ugly no longer found her when spoken in memory, that it had lost its edge once it was no longer believed. She sat among the women, mending, listening, occasionally laughing, not the brittle laughter of survival, but the easy kind that did not ask permission. And she understood that what her family had intended as a joke had delivered her into the one place that measured people by what lasted rather than what dazzled. When night settled and the stars came clear, she lay down without bracing for the return of shame, knowing that the dream the Lakota had always carried was not something she had become, but something she had already been long before anyone noticed, and that being everything they had dreamed of did not mean being extraordinary, only being true, present, and unwilling to leave when leaving would have been easier, a truth that finally belonged to her alone, steady and unmocked, held not by laughter or approval, but by a life chosen in daylight and lived without apology. Some people are sent away as jokes because the world does not know what to do with quiet strength. This was not a story about beauty discovered or kindness earned, but about endurance finally placed where it belonged. She was mocked, traded, and underestimated, and still became the one who held when everything else wavered. And sometimes redemption is not found by changing who you are, but by walking far enough to let the truth of you finally matter.